We would like to begin by first respectfully acknowledging that Mass Poetry and Salem, Massachusetts are on the ancestral land of the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Massachusetts, Namkeek, and Agawam peoples. Many other Indigenous communities have lived and moved through this land over hundreds of years, and many Indigenous people work and live in these regions today. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. We at Mass Poetry are intentional about ensuring that our events are accessible to everyone attending and involved in the festival. We have closed captioning available for this event. If you can't see them, you can turn them on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then clicking show subtitles. If you'd like to turn them off, you can just choose hide subtitles. For anyone who is using auto captions today, just to ensure that chat messages don't pop up over the captioning, just click on the chat at the bottom of the screen and it will open to a chat panel on the right side. If you're having any trouble with these logistics or anything else about navigating Zoom, please feel free to send myself a private Zoom message and I'll help you out. Regarding other Zoom etiquette, just please keep yourself muted unless you're invited to unmute by the speakers. There's many ways for us to interact with each other during the panel, either via the chat or the Zoom reactions button. And we really encourage you to use all of those as a way to engage with each other and show your love and support to our awesome panelists. Please be kind and respectful to the event producers and your fellow participants. We will remove participants for any discriminatory or harassing comments, and in those cases, you might not be able to attend further festival events. Well, thank you so much for listening, and I'll hand it over. Let's get started.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to Gabrielle and Ashvarya and Mass Poetry Festival for all their help with this. Also, thanks to Ryan and Selena, our ASL interpreters, and Monica, who will be joining us soon, our captioner. And hello to everybody. Welcome to We Are in the Room, a panel of abilities. I'm Leslie McIntosh, and I will be your host and moderator for this. I'm zooming into you from the office of my home in Jersey City, New Jersey, which is the unceded land of the indigenous tribe, the Munsee Lenape. I am male, he, him, his. I'm Black. I'm in my mid-30s. I'm wearing glasses that have a lattice work pattern along the upper rim. I'm wearing a button-down short sleeve shirt. It is navy blue with tiny teal lobsters scattered all around it. My hair is dyed blonde and it's in this messy frohawk. And I have bookshelves in the back of the room. In the wake, or perhaps awakening, following the COVID-19 pandemic, issues of access, justice, and equity have become more than just commonplace. People have become more intentional and fearless in the questions they pose, and they want real answers. This panel is part of that questioning. Many of you may have expected us as practicing poets to have answers to give during this panel. I'd like to think they are all here to help each other ask better questions. I'm joined by 4 amazing poets working in the realm of disability. It's study, activism, justice, and art. They are Sylvia Chan, Jim Ferris, Camisha Jones, and Stephen Kuusisto, all of whom and myself are part of Zooglasia, a literary organization seeking to pioneer a new inclusive space for poets with disabilities. Sylvia Chan is an amputee writer, educator, and activist. She hails from the San Francisco Bay Area, where she performed as a jazz pianist. She lives in Tucson, where she teaches in the writing program at the University of Arizona and serves as court advocate for foster kids in Pima County and nonfiction editor at Entropy. Her debut collection is We Remain Traditional, Center for Literary Publishing 2018, and her essays appear in Prairie Schooner, The Rumpus, and the Best American Non-Required Reading 2019.
My name is Sylvia Chan, and I am a young Chinese American woman with long brown hair. I'm wearing a short sleeve purple romper with white flowers. I am in my office, which has white walls and a window reflecting Arizona sunlight in Tucson, where the University of Arizona sits on the traditional land of the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial.
Jim Ferris is author of Slouching Towards Guantanamo, Facts of Life, and the Hospital Poems. Past president of the Society for Disability Studies and the Disabled and Deaf Writers Caucus, he has received awards for performance and mathematics, as well as poetry and creative nonfiction. His work has appeared in Poetry, the Georgia Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, and Text and Performance Quarterly, among others. Ferris was Poet Laureate of Lucas County, Ohio, 2015 to 2019. He earned a doctorate in Performance Studies. He currently holds the Ability Center Endowed Chair in Disability Studies at the University of Toledo.
And he has to take a moment to unmute too. Hi, thank you, Leslie. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all with us. I'm Jim Ferris. I'm a white presenting man with sandy gray hair. My background is a lovely view of the Golden Gate Bridge, which you can see from where I am actually seated right now in Toledo, Ohio. It's amazing. I live and work on the traditional lands of the Miami, the Ottawa, Wea, Shawnee, Potawatomi, and Wyandot tribes. And I'm happy to be with you here.
Thanks, Jim. Camisha L. Jones is the author of Flair, Finishing Line Press 2017. Her poems can be found at the New York Times, poets.org, Button Poetry, the Deaf Poets Society, Typo, The Quarry, and elsewhere. She was one of the Loft Literary Center's 2017 Spoken Word Immersion Fellows and competed at the 2013 National Poetry Slam. Camisha is managing director at Split This Rock, a national nonprofit in DC that centers poetry that bears witness to injustice and provokes change. Find her on Facebook at Poet Camisha Jones and on Twitter and Instagram as #1 Camisha.
Hi, everyone. This is Camisha. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a brown-skinned cis woman with dark brown hair styled in flat twists and two-strand twists. I'm wearing glasses and a green and black print blouse. Behind me is a black bookcase, a white wall, and a framed black and white picture of trees. I'm tuning in from my home in Herndon, Virginia, where the Manahoac people once resided and cared for the land. I acknowledge them and their descendants respectfully to bring attention to erasure within the telling of US history, believing it is critically important to remember this country's history of stolen land and stolen labor in order to take effective action toward liberation.
Thanks, Camisha. Stephen Kuusisto holds a university professorship at Syracuse and is the author of the memoirs Have Dog Will Travel, A Poet's Journey, Planet of the Blind, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and Eavesdropping, a memoir of blindness and listening, and of the poetry collections Only Bread, Only Light, Letters to Borges, and Old Horse, What Is to Be Done. He travels and lectures widely on human rights, disability, literature, and the advantages of guide dogs and human-animal relationships.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you all of the panelists. I am a 66-year-old Finnish American with a big pink head, graying hair, slightly impish grin. I'm seated in front of a painting of a shipwreck that I inherited from my parents, and it's too big to hang anywhere in my house. So it's here behind me in my basement study. I'm wearing a gray pullover or jumper, as the British would say, and pronouns he, him. I'm really delighted to be here. I am coming to you really from Syracuse, New York, and the university where I teach acknowledges with respect the Onondaga Nation, fire keepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University, and indeed the whole city, now stands.
Thank you, poets, for your introductions and welcoming us all into the space. I'd like to start our conversation with a consideration of the body as self, as home, as point of departure, as past, as future, as the now. In Camisha Jones's Flare, we encounter a body that devours its own pain and uses it as a source of combustion, the spark of figurative flame. Jones says in the free verse poem, Accommodation, my body is a pyromaniac. My body is the art. In Ode of the Chronically Ill Body, the anaphoric hammer of this body throughout the poem won't allow us to not consider this body and its human needs. We are made to see the sparks fly. This fire serves as a metaphor for agency, the heat of self-determination, and the refusal of disappearance. It burns the edges of the exterior social world, and it dares the social world to do something about it. Maybe, perhaps, make fair room. A poetic of nonviolent direct action, of humane insurrection, is at work in Flare. I'd like to invite the poets to talk about how their own practice seeks to claim fair space and hold it, both for themselves and others who are convenient targets for erasure due to their differing abilities, even against the opposition of ableism. What have you seen lost? What have you gained?
I suppose I can jump in first. I was just talking with everyone about some of this. I have lived my life on both sides of disability. I've spent a long time of my life not thinking of myself as disabled. And then when my body made it absolutely necessary for me to interrupt the standard norm, that's the moment when I started realizing the power in shifting that perspective. By identifying as disabled, I became connected to groups. I became connected to information. So that's definitely one thing that's been gained, was just my really embracing myself and embracing the fact that my body is different from what the norm wants to demand of me. Was a way for me to expand consciousness around what the amount of contortions we require of people just to live their lives. And it empowered me to be someone that just interrupts that. In some ways, I can't avoid interrupting that because my body requires me to, but also it gives me the tools now to say, hey, is there going to be captioning? Hey, are you doing visual descriptions? Hey, do you know this new technique? Because I know when I was on that side where I didn't identify as disabled, my big problem was I wasn't aware. Like I just had no information at all. And I know there are a lot of people like that in the world who just don't have the information. And I don't want to be, if people come into my presence, it won't be because I didn't say something that they didn't know.
Camisha, I love what you're saying about the choice to identify as a full self and how that opens the door to different ways of knowing that then get to open doors for other people who themselves didn't know that there were other doors possible. So thank you for that. Thank you. Are there any what other poets? What do we think about that? About the choice to insist upon your full presence and your full self as Camisha talks about, the body being the art, not being, not just being the sum of all the cells that make us up, but being a finished product that is beautiful and essential, exactly as it is.
I'm very self-conscious about not being able to see the visual cues here. And so I don't want to talk over anybody. But I'll say just quickly, this is Steve Kuusisto. I was born blind, and I have been told at every stage of my life, from childhood till just today, that I don't belong in almost every room that I seek to enter, whether that is a elementary school classroom or a faculty meeting where there are no accessible documents and overheads. And the ableism that accompanies normative society is ubiquitous and unrelenting. And so when you speak up for yourself, you're often treated to eye rolling at best, and often, real put downs. And I have found disability writing, disability art, as a way for me to engage with a kind of daily practice of the spider, rebuilding the web, rebuilding the faith, rebuilding the ardor of being alive, and also being different. And so I have found that writing particularly has given me the opportunity to resist, to react, and to change the course of the narratives I tell myself in reaction to a difficult society, and also to change the course of my own projective thinking about where I might go.
This is Jim. And in so doing, you make other narratives available to the wide world, to other people that are out there. This just finished semester, I had the pleasure to teach a class on crip arts and crip culture. And one of the things that we talked a lot about in the class was about the presence of, we could even call it sort of the interpenetration of disability culture in the larger world. Because one of the things that the conclusions that we drew in the class is that most disabled people, like most non-disabled people, are not particularly aware of disability culture and disability arts as vibrant and affirmative forces in the world. But that doesn't mean that they are unaffected by it and by what we do. We're mostly unaware of, like, for example, the strong force in physics, but we wouldn't exist without it. Disability culture is real, it is here. We are making it. That's one of the things that I push the students to do, is to recognize themselves as makers of culture, not just observers or consumers, but makers. And to recognize the ways that disabled people and disability culture are making the world incrementally better for non-disabled people as well as disabled ones.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's Leslie again. And that's such an excellent segue into my next question that was inspired by some of your work, Jim. In Jim Ferris's The Hospital's poem, the speaker's embodiment is colder and quieter. The body is a place of exile for those who are deemed broken. He says in the poem, in a poem, until our bodies are corrected, until the gods deign to let us go, we are children of no one. An exile wherein the pain of the exiled is assumed as normal and for his own good, for our own good. And agency enough to say, choose what kind of milk to drink is absurd. These decisions are made by those who are themselves trapped by their own invisible able-bodiedness. Ferris says in the sonnet, Poet of Cripples, room of our own, space to grow in ways unmanageable to the straight and the narrow, the small and similar, the poor, normal ones who do not know their poverty. Look with care, look deep. Here is a voice that burrows within his own body, partly because the speaker was chased there, but partly because there, away from the gaze of ableness, a different way of understanding the body can take shape. If Jones's poetry is a poetry of disability insurrection, then Ferris's poetry is a poetry of disability insurgency, of internal capacity building and covert resource allocation, of politeness that appears to be pure compliance, but is really a smokescreen for the imagining of a future where the suffering of the disabled is not a given. I'd like the poets to discuss how their own interiority relates to disability, invisible or otherwise. How does your creative subjectivity respond to the gaze of ableism?
This is Jim. Like Steve, I've been disabled since birth. And so I have extensive experience at how I am situated or perceived in the wide world, and the opportunities to choose how to respond to that. One of the things that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently is I'm trying to think how to put this. I don't have a good way to say this quite yet, but the pressure to sort of perform disabledness in poems. I was just looking back at a review of one of my books or something that was critiquing the work for not being solely centered in what the reviewer thought should be a disabled subjectivity or something. And, you know, it struck me as quite bizarre. And actually I got a really nice, if somewhat snotty poem out of it in response. There's a way in which my disability experience just informs my being in the world. And so one of the things that I think is that I don't have to perform disability in order to be a disabled poet, a crip poet. I get to write about anything and everything in the whole world. And the vantage point of the atypical, to use Simi Linton's phrase, is going to show through, because this is from my perspective, and this is my set of languages and the things that I see and the crotchets and obsessions and all of that stuff is just going to come out. And so there are times when I feel like there is a certain pressure to represent, but mostly, when I pick up the pen and work or play with poems, that's someplace else. I don't have to worry about that. I just get to play and see what happens. And that often what happens may directly reflect my own particular experience of being a disabled body in an ableist world. And maybe it doesn't,
I love that. So who gets to decide what disabled is? I was speaking with folks before this panel, my own experience with autism spectrum disorder, and also I'm an educator, and so I'm surrounded by people who have these specific understandings of how that's supposed to work, and then there is the responsibility and also the joy of having to assert in the way that Camisha mentioned, well, no, that isn't necessarily what it is for everybody who identifies in this way. And then getting to see how people respond and reorganize, if they choose to reorganize their understanding after I say that, that's always an interesting moment.
This is Sylvia. I would like to add to what Jim and Leslie just mentioned. So on the surface, I have one fake hand, one real hand, one partially mobile leg, one real leg. The entire left side of my body needs some help writing and walking. In academia, and sometimes I find it difficult to walk away or move away from academics and creative, since many of that is so blurred in terms of ableism. My livelihood depends on advocating for my self-care. I'm the only disabled Asian American woman of my rank. There's no one else like me. I have to say I can't take notes for meetings. I need to be scheduled in rooms that allow my service dog or elevator access. I can't ignore microaggressions. And these are all things that, in the ways that academia can be violent for those who are already partially out of the room. Where this segues into my creativity, I try very hard not to, when you have friends, able friends who say, why don't you write about your disability, your marginalization, your otherness, and treat that as a metaphor, as something to write about. That doesn't make me feel better. It doesn't make me want to write in a way that doesn't align with myself. I am still an amputee pianist, still a pianist. Just because I'm a cyborg doesn't mean I've forgotten 500 jazz standards. Just because I don't write in a notebook doesn't mean I don't know my own music and repeat them until I can write. I've learned that, if I'm thinking about driving, I only need one hand and one leg to do that. And I made that work. To access Zoom and online teaching, I need to master 3 sensations of touch: click, drag, right click. So it's taking apart minute movements, one moment at a time, not thinking so much of as the person I used to be and the person I will frankly never be able to return to.
And all of that is, this is Leslie again, all of that is incredible labor. And it brings to mind Jim's sonnet. It's labor that everybody is doing, even the able-bodied, but we are the people who are not considered that, who have barriers of access to overcome, have to do that work in a way that is, in a way that we can perceive. We have to feel the resistance of that. And that's to our benefit. And it's something that we get to bring to others too, because they can realize that, hey, you're doing this too. You're laboring in certain ways too. You just don't know. Okay. And that brings it, okay. And so in Stephen Kuusisto's Old Horse, What Is to Be Done, we see how memory is both servant and liberator of the senses. From notes, journal entries, years, seeming pages of notebooks, and even travelogue, Kuusisto leaves us a record of things, but not as they are or even necessarily as they were. What we have here is a living record of a self-concept. Where Ferris brings us to the door of deep and personal subjectivity, Kuusisto pulls us inside and takes us to another door, the door of world building and reworlding, of interconnection between place, occasion, time, and register in many modes of sense-making. He remakes sense in his own image. Kuusisto says from lyric and journalistic fragments of the piece, Praxis, Deliberate Beauty, it's a hard life and art won't help you. Words are occasionally lethal. Language is a trick, God knows. In the space of this poem, we explore a Helsinki that moves back and forth through time and the speaker's own recollection. Things are there, yes, but then things are lost too. There are holes in the story, but the story is still the story. He says, sometimes I see a child, see in him what I was like, and I want to say I'm sorry. The self-concept is never done in a world that still reminds us of what was and is and will be. In the end, as poets, we have our poems. Kuusisto says, I wanted to be useful, so I wrote a poem. It was about Orpheus and his birds. So every bird was in it, all the birds in the world, and each bird that has ever been, and it was not beautiful, but terribly alive, like a god who assumes a single shape in a sudden wind. Poets, in your own practice, how do you refuse the sense of the world as it is given? How do you privilege your own senses? How do you order and reorder the world in service of your own hard-earned subjectivity?
Well, I might just jump in and say that one of the dilemmas for blind writers is, of course, that certain kinds of spontaneity are hard to achieve when you can't see. So it takes a long time for blind people to learn independent travel and to learn to do it safely, and then to learn to do it with a kind of adventurous sense of engagement and joy. I wrote a book of poems a few years ago called Letters to Borges, in which a recurring theme are poems having to do with my desire to talk to the great Argentine blind poet Borges, who never learned to travel independently and had to be led everywhere by sighted people throughout his life. And so for him, spontaneity was really something that he never quite achieved. And if you're with sighted people all the time and they're narrating for you what's going on, then you're getting a kind of secondhand experience. And so, although he had one of the great capacious lyrical imaginations and was a total genius, on the other hand, I felt badly for him as a blind person. I learned how to travel independently with a guide dog and then began touring the world. And the first thing I wanted to do was to learn how to go places and get lost, productively lost.
Mm.
Go to cities that I hadn't been to before and just wander around, meet strangers, overhear casual conversation, discover things on the fly, right? And so those things enter into not only the poems and letters to Borges, but as you point out, they're in the poems in the more recent book, right? The chance encounters become a vital part of the tapestry that is the poetry. And then you factor in blindness, which is really interesting because every street crossing for me is a moment of faith. Will I get across the street? Will I survive it? Or will I get run over? And so, I joke all the time with my friends, my every street crossing is a Hemingway moment. I'm running the bulls in Pamplona each time I cross the street. And so paying attention, listening, being willing to get lost for the sheer joy of it, and also concentrating on the tiniest details. All of those things enter into the lyric life that I've tried to create for myself, both on the page and and in the day.
Thank you, Jen. I'm like blown away by this. This is Leslie again, by the way. By this, idea of productively lost. And it just brings to mind one of my favorite scriptures from Octavia Butler's Parable series, where she talks about basically you have to come to terms with how little you know about anything at all in order to take any productive steps into the future. You have to admit that you are really, really ignorant all the time in many, many ways. And I love that your response highlights the beauty of that acceptance, of just surrendering to, there's a whole other way that I can understand this world and how it works that I just typically don't engage in.
I'm going to jump in on this question as well. I'm thinking about refusing society wanting me to believe that I am broken. And it's definitely been the biggest hurdle in terms of me coming into my own awareness as a disabled person. And prior to that, that's how I'd been living. It wasn't, I'd already had Meniere's disease, already had fibromyalgia, probably close to 10 years of living with those conditions. But feeling it was my responsibility to tone them down, feeling it was my responsibility to make other people feel comfortable and present this quote unquote capable face. Coming into consciousness has allowed me to refuse thinking of myself as broken. I remember one moment where someone asked me when I used the phrase hearing impaired, like, is that how you see yourself? Do you see yourself as impaired? And it comes back to me often now when I'm like, no, I don't. Like, I am not impaired. Like, I am here to disrupt, and that's a gift. And what I am able to quote unquote hear now is different at times because of my Meniere's disease. So I'm able to hear sound at one point in the day differently than I do later in the day. But I always now am able to also notice what people aren't saying in their actions. Like, if people aren't repeating themselves, if they aren't slowing down their pace when I'm asking, if they forget what I've told them about what I need in order to navigate the world regularly. Like, that's a sentence. That's absolutely telling me some information. I hear that very clearly now, and that's a gift. I also hear a lot about productivity, what it means to be effective as someone in this society in a career. And I think there's something for us all to learn around that, especially within this age of this pandemic, where we've all needed to make some adjustments. We needed some time out, everybody. Like, our bodies need time out. Our bodies need rest. We are not meant to just hustle and crank out and grind and not sleep. Like, it's just, we have something to give the world in terms of the way the disabled body says stop, pause, slow down. So.
Agreed. Agreed. And we're going to get into our final question for the panel. And where the self-concept, self-possessed with power of perception and imagination, may reorder the world as Kuusisto does, that it navigates, so too does the world have a say in how our private universes are constructed, at least partly, by our experiences. In Sylvia Chan's We Remain Traditional, we see the power of trauma to transform how we understand ourselves and our own histories, and how trauma can divorce us from our own autobiographies. Chan illustrates dissociation, hypervigilance, shame, and silence, but most powerfully, she demonstrates the power of the intellect to shield the self-concept, even while it is being assaulted. Chan says in the poem, In the Bellows, I understand my sensuality is false. My body is an intellectual power, and you tilt towards your chest. The shame seated in the body makes the body seem like a liar, and the mind an impartial judge. False, of course, but reasonable in the context of trauma survival. In a way, We Remain Traditional is a depiction of someone surviving being gaslit by their own mode of coping. And we see them triumph. In the same poem, Chan leaves us here. You'll see it's no coincidence I'm no longer 7. I'm 22, and the scales of justice are based on our consciousness. We don't mature or heal by accident. We work for it. Our consciousness is tested and taxed, for some much more than others. Poets, how have the labors you've done to heal tested your resolve? How do you bring that to bear on your own poetics and practice?
I guess I'll start with this one. Thank you, Leslie, for all your thoughtful and caring questions. So much of poetry is about touch. I can't help but but shut down when I'm directed to write down my textures, which can only live in my long-term memories before disability. I have to remember and to imagine what holding hands with my partner feels like. I have to get over not being able to technically perform music anymore, but that doesn't mean that I can't play music for myself and not think so much of how much that sounds. My brain doesn't connect to my prosthetic, but these parts still work in their own ways. So I think that has helped me care less about making mistakes, because it seems also futile to spend so much of our lives worrying about those maneuvers I cannot control. That being said, I think I still have a lot to come to terms with in acknowledging how my disabilities sexualize me. I have yet to say with freedom how I'm asked to do things with my prosthetic, how I'm asked to feel another's touch as if, you know, they're the exception, they're the one I can finally feel temperature, pain, touch, light bulb will pop up. When I was writing We Remain Traditional, I had 26 poems that didn't make it into the collection. Many of these poems had to do with amputations. And I think the ones that did make it into the book, they still work with that indirectly, directly. A lot of my current writing on foster care have to do with amputations. Neither of these books are what I would primarily call about disability, but I'm not a singular subject. I'm an intersectional being who's not done. I'm an amputee and a cyborg who is literally spliced when I became disabled. That is a forever image, one I think is worth redocumenting until who knows when I'm ready to let go.
Thank you, Sylvia. I love we're multiple. We contain the multitudes.
Sylvia, that was terrific. Thank you. I am just, absorbing. That really was wonderful. I don't know whether this is easy for the rest of you to engage with, but I find being disabled on a daily basis both joyous and beautiful and surprising, and certainly a vehicle for the imagination. On the other hand, I have found being a blind professor in higher education to be really awful. There's an enormous amount of ableism on college faculty, college administrations. I've been a tenured professor at 3 universities, but it's been really painful. And, I'm 66 years old and it's still painful. And so that one of the things I really strive for when I'm away from, the workaday world and I can be in the cave of making, as Auden would call it, is I'm concentrating on something that's really almost spiritual, right? I'm trying to imagine letting go of the daily bitternesses, the indignities. I want to die happy. I want to let go of burdens, right? I don't want to sound all new agey here, but I'm a disability rights activist. I fight on behalf of other people. I get involved. I don't shy away from confronting ableism in all of its varieties. And yet at the same time, I find that the arts help me breathe out, let go, be led by other parts of the imagination, which is a kind of compensatory joyousness that comes out of the arts. And, I've certainly written plenty of angry things. So I'm not suggesting that I'm making an editorial choice here to just simply go all Pollyanna. But I do think that I have found that poetry in particular has allowed me to get it one step removed from the daily difficulties and think about the soul. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's what I got.
It does. It makes a lot of sense. This is Leslie again. And a part of the healing is like from what you're saying. My mind is gravitating to like this idea that you have to give up, like this idea that you're going to win, that you're going to be victorious over ableism. that is being victorious over anything or anyone isn't really the point. So there is a certain amount of letting go that you have to do to enable yourself to move forward in productive ways that are still anti-ableist, but preserve just, your capacity to do emotional labor without, becoming someone who's bitter, I guess I would say. You have to choose your battles in a way that preserves you. Is what I'm hearing.
There's a great line by W.S. Merwin. He says, I live up here and a little to the left, and I come down, but only for the accidents, and then not a moment too soon. And I think, the imagination is the up here, right? It's Mount Olympus. And you come down for the tough stuff, but you pick and choose, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that that particular way of navigating the creative subjectivity is something that we see in your work, where you're reordering information in a way that isn't accountable to, that there's information that's described visually, that is described through sight, but at the same time, if it's presented, if we're using language's ability to shift and shape perception, how much of that do we actually owe to sight? How much of it actually finds its home in just an eye's ability to see? Who's to say that that same information doesn't come through some other mode of sense making, or so some other way of understanding? And a poetic of letting go, I think, opens the door to that sort of reordering, because you have to let go of what was in order to be available to something, anything else. So thank you.
This is Jim. I'm interested in just thinking about the ways that we have the choices about how much energy to put into resistance from, resistance against normative society, and the pressures toward the norms that the society places on us. This is very much on my mind right now because I'm in the process of getting a new brace made and fitted. And I'm still in the stage where I absolutely hate it and would happily chuck it out the window. And a part of that I know has to do with I think that this is particularly true of practitioners, of therapeutic practitioners, but there's a way in which I think of poetry critics often as therapeutic practitioners of a sort themselves, in that there's a certain kind of normalizing impulse that we wind up having to choose how much energy to expend in resisting. Am I making sense here? I'm thinking about the ways that, for example, the physical therapist wants to adjust my body to be more like the norm, rather than to be more like my body and how my body works, rather than the mythical, the mythical body, the mythical ideal. And I feel like there are those kinds of pressures often in poetry world as well, to conform to whatever the dominant range of expression is in the time. There's a way in which we live in a time of rich possibility right now, because there are, I'm thinking about that great Howard Nemeroff line of 60 years ago or something, when he was asked about the direction of American poetry. What direction is it going? He said, all directions at once. And there's a way in which I think we have only extended that. But that idea of labor, and that it takes labor to do that, is, I think, really on point.
I love that. And, I worked for many years, as you probably remember, Jim, at a guide dog school that they invented the guide dog for people who are blind and deaf. And they also invented making it possible for people who are missing limbs or have profound, other disabling conditions besides blindness to get guide dogs. And one of the things that they were always preaching there, and I found it so fascinating, was that no two people who have a particular disability actually experience it the same way as anybody else. And this is also true for us within our own respective bodies over the course of a day. I start the day and I can see a little bit like this, and I use it a little bit, but then by noon I've got a grinding headache, and I can't function that way, and I need an ice pack on my head, and I even have to lie down, and so that learning how to work with the body is its own kind of symphonic deconstruction. And then on top of that, right, you've got the ableist society with its normative expectations. Why aren't you like those other blind people? Well, yeah, I'm not, I trace it back to some DNA from Ostrobothnia, I'm really different. So just the arts are so great because we get to play with all these layerings, right? It's an architectonic, multi-layered puzzle that we're all pointing out. And I think that when we really look at disability, we discovered that there is no dividing line between disability literature and the rest of literature, right? James Joyce was blind when he wrote Ulysses. Ernest Hemingway had bipolar depression and PTSD. We go down the list, and just about all the people who are considered normative writers, it turns out they were disabled too. Where does that stop, right? So, maybe it's just the case that all literature has to do with the vagaries and fragilities and even fearsome, dynamics of the body, and that writers with disabilities can help broaden our understanding about that remarkable dynamic of the imagination. By the way, Howard Nemeroff once said one of the funniest things I've ever heard. In a writing workshop class at Iowa, he told someone in the class that they should divide their poem in half. And then he said, and then throw away the halves.
Agreed. I love that. Like, as writers, we complicate, and I imagine it's very hard to complicate if your range, if the frames and the ranges and the registers that you're accessing to complicate are only what's already been available. That's not very complex. It makes me think about lots of people, Louise Gleick and others have talked about Claudia Rankine, and others have discussed that the poem, they don't write poems, they find them or they are found by them. And I think that that's such an interesting, the imagination has to be available, which means that it has to be willing to question itself. It has to be able to doubt safely doubt. And that's what lets us do what we do. That's what lets us be who we are. I want to thank all of our poets. We're going to hand it back over to the festival organizers. Thanks, Jim and Sylvia and Camisha and Steve, for sharing your time and your wisdom and your poetry. We didn't get to do a reading because of the time constraints, but this has been really rich. I've read the books, buy the books, get the books. They're very accessible. So thank you.
Can I jump in for just a second? I want to thank my colleagues on the panel for this wonderful discussion, but I really want to thank you, Leslie, for these great questions that you've crafted for us to get into some really complicated and deep and rich stuff. So thanks to you for organizing this and for giving us such good stuff to think about.
Oh, thank you so much, Jim. It was a pleasure. This has been a pleasure to have this conversation. And I just look forward to this being a normal conversation. No longer being a panel worthy conversation is what I'm looking forward to. So thank you all for being a part of, taking some like immeasurable step towards that becoming a reality.
How wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of our poets. I will be dropping some of their info into the chat where you can find them, how you can support their work. Other poets, feel free to do that as well, so folks can follow up with you. Everyone in the panel, please feel free to show your appreciation to our poets, either in the chat or on camera.